गुड आफ्टरनून एवरीबॉडी, नमस्कार। रिहेबिलिटेशन काउंसिल ऑफ इंडिया के नवशिखर चैनल में आपके स्वागत है। आज का हमारा टॉपिक है इंक्लूसिव एजुकेशन फॉर ऑटिज्म, यानी कि समेकित शिक्षा ऑटिज्म स्पेक्ट्रम डिसऑर्डर के लिए। हमारे जो वेरी वेरी स्पेशल रिसोर्स पर्सन है, हर नेम इज़ मिसेस मेरी बरुआ. I'm sure everybody in India knows her and many people abroad. She is a specialist in autism spectrum disorders. She runs an excellent center called Action for Autism. She runs courses. She was one of the first ones to run the autism spectrum disorder course. When we were developing the syllabus for this course, she was one of the main resource persons and in writing the material also. We have today Mary, who's apart from being all of this, she's a member of the she's board for National Trust, and she served on the National Trust for I think 3 terms.
Yeah.
Yes, and she's also a parent of a young man with autism. Today we are going to talk specifically on inclusive education, where persons with autism are concerned. Mary, over to you. If Mary will do a presentation and then उसके बाद हम questions करेंगे, और questions के लिए मैं आपसे आपको बता दूं कि हमारे जो numbers है ये ऐसा है टोल फ्री नंबर, जिसे कोई पैसा नहीं देना पड़ेगा। वो नंबर है 1800112008। दोबारा बताऊं, 1800112008। और फिर नंबर है 011 जो कि दिल्ली का कोड है 265111613। 01126511613। हमारा फैक्स भी है, फैक्स में भी यू कैन सेंड योर क्वेश्चन थ्रू फैक्स। आप फैक्स में क्वेश्चंस प्रश्न भेज सकते हैं। वो नंबर है 01126511609। 01126511609। हम लोग चाहते हैं कि ये सेशन बहुत इंटरैक्टिव हो। आपके जितने कंसर्न्स है, इश्यूज़ हैं कि ऑटिस्टिक पर्सन्स स्कूल में जा सकते हैं या नहीं, दूसरों के साथ पढ़ सकते हैं नहीं, इसके बारे में आज हम चर्चा करेंगे। मैरी बरुआ।
Thank you, Aluka. It's a privilege to be here to make this presentation, and I hope we would have an interactive session as I make the presentation. What I would like to start with is with an understanding of inclusion. हम जब inclusion के बारे में बोलते हैं, people often think in terms of हम ramp लगा दे, braille signages दे दे, braille के लिए किताब रख दे, maybe somebody for sign language for people who are hearing impaired. मगर उससे ज़्यादा जब हम कोई social adaptations करने का ज़रूरत होता है, then we tend to think that it is not possible, क्योंकि हमें बहुत ज़्यादा करना होता है और students जो आएंगे उसको हमारे साथ adapt करना पड़ेगा। तो the whole concept जो होता है कि जो students हमारे पास आ रहे हैं, हम उसको जितना हम जिसको बोलते हैं नॉर्मल बना दे सकते हैं, वी थिंक इन टर्म्स ऑफ नॉर्मलाइजिंग देम। और जब हम नॉर्मल के बारे बोलते हैं, वी थिंक इन टर्म्स ऑफ बाकी सब लोग जैसे हैं वैसा ही होना है। ना दैट इज़ अ वेरी मेडिकल मॉडल अप्रोच कि हम कोई तरीके के क्योर करके नॉर्मल करके उसको फिट करवा दें। एंड दैट इज़ द काइंड ऑफ कॉन्सेप्ट दैट वी हैव अबाउट इंक्लूजन। बट इंक्लूजन रियली इज़ नॉट अबाउट लुकिंग एट अ चाइल्ड एज अ प्रॉब्लम, कि ये इसकी कुछ मुश्किलें हैं, इसको हम फिक्स कर दे, इसको चेंज कर दे, जैसे कि ये हमारा जो स्कूल्स हैं यहाँ पर फिट कर जाएगा। हम जब वैसे सोचते हैं तब हम इंडिविजुअल्स का जो इंडिविजुअल नीड्स रहता है हम उसको नहीं देखते हैं। वी टेंड टू लुक एट स्कूल क्या है और इंडिविजुअल को उस हिसाब से बदलना। तो द राइट टू बी डिफरेंट, हर इंडिविजुअल का जो एक डिफरेंट का राइट है, like I have a right to be a woman and exist in society, and I have a right to be have certain cultural ways that come from the part of the country I am from. और जब हम विदेश में जाते हैं, my Indianness का जो एक cultural rights रहता है, that has to be respected, right? So similarly, it's like, for instance, जो सिख्स है टर्बन्स पहनते हैं, राइट, और इसके लिए फाइट कर रहे हैं, और विदेश में बोलते हैं कि दे हैव टू फिट इनटू what it is, but we are beginning to understand that people have a right to be different. So countries and societies are now looking at making adaptations so that people who wear turbans can go to school with turbans, or people who need to wear a kada can wear a kada and go to school and exist in society. So that right to be different has to be respected. और हम जब disability के बारे सोचते हैं, हम we think in terms of क्या नहीं कर सकता है, और हम जो कर सकते हैं वो नहीं कर सकता है. So there is a kind of cultural imperialism that goes along with that. But inclusion is about seeing हर इंसान में क्या strengths है. Inclusion is not about seeing इंसान में क्या faults है और वो fault को हम fix कर देंगे. ये बच्चा आया है, इसमें तो ये कमी है, इसको हमको fix करना है. Inclusion है देखना कि स्कूल में क्या कमी है जिसको हमें चेंज करना है, जैसे कि कोई भी बच्चा आकर स्कूल में पढ़ सकता है. So it is a very clear shift. जब हम बच्चे का फॉल्ट्स को देखते हैं और उसको फिक्स करना है, हम तब एक मेडिकल मॉडल में चले जाते हैं. और जब हम देखते हैं स्कूल्स का क्या कमी है जिसको हमें बदलना है, जिसे हमको चेंज करना है, जैसे कि हर इंसान स्कूल में पढ़ सकता है, then we are looking at a social model of disability. And when we talk inclusion, हमें ये डिसेबिलिटी का सोशल मॉडल देखना बहुत ही ज़रूरी होता है. So again, to get back to it, when we do inclusion, we don't look at the child as a problem. जो usually होता है, when the child comes to a school, even nursery में जब admission के लिए आते हैं, जो teachers देखते हैं बोलते हैं, what is his problem? Right? वो बच्चे का कोई problem नहीं है, he is different. And that different has to be accepted and celebrated. So inclusion में we have to stop looking at the problem on the child, and we have to start looking at what are their strengths. So it has to be a complete social and cultural shift from the way we typically view somebody जिसका कुछ specific needs है, and we all have certain specific needs, right? I have a specific need right now. हम ये जो 2 hours बात करेंगे, I need to have the water here. I cannot speak without it. So similarly, others have specific needs. Somebody who has a hearing impairment has specific needs. Somebody who has autism has specific needs, right? We do not necessarily view those as problems. So when we view inclusion, we view the whole situation as a situation that we have to restructure. We have to change the policies, we have to change the practices in the schools so that they are able to look at the differences that there are in students and make adaptations and accommodations for the students. And also जब हम inclusion के बारे बात करेंगे, हम खाली ऐसे नहीं देखेंगे कि हम ऑटिस्टिक बच्चे के लिए इंक्लूजन कर रहे हैं. We have to think in terms of inclusion for anybody who has what is called a special educational need, or what I was just referring to as a specific need. So it is not merely people with one kind of a need जिसके लिए हमको inclusion करना है, but people with any kind of different needs जिसके लिए we have to change policies, change structures, change practices to welcome learners of every kind of need into schools. That is what inclusion is all about. The one thing जो हम कभी-कभी we lose sight of, हम कभी भूल जाते हैं, is that हम जब education में inclusion के बारे बात कर रहे हैं, it is just one part of a very wide picture. That is not the end. That is, the end really is inclusion in society. हम जब इंक्लूसिव एजुकेशन के बारे में बात करते हैं, वी आर रियली टॉकिंग इन टर्म्स ऑफ इंक्लूजन इन सोसाइटी, एंड इंक्लूजन इन एजुकेशन इज merely a step to that final stage of how we can have every individual live as a fully participating member of society. And that long term sight we don't want to ever lose sight of, because kabhi kabhi hota hai, we think in terms of inclusion in a school and the child is just put in and we think, oh, we are very happy the child has gone into a mainstream school. How the child is faring in the school is something that we forget to look at. स्कूल में चला गया है, सबके साथ है, good enough. At the end of the 5, 6, 7 years that the child is in the school, when he comes out, उसका जो skills है, do those skills prepare him for leading a life, inclusive life in society, or does it not? If it does not, then that inclusive education has lost its value. Because if we are looking at it as the end, inclusive education as being the end to what we want to achieve, then we have really missed the wood for the trees. हमें याद रखना है always कि जब हम inclusive education के बारे बात कर रहे हैं, we are thinking in terms of life after school, of living in society as a participating, contributing member of society. So when we talk of inclusive education, particularly in children who have an autism spectrum disorder, the first thing we have to look at is how early am I starting? As we know, and I'm assuming that all of us who are participating in this discussion have some understanding of autism. So we know that when we discuss autism, we are thinking in terms of people who have different learning styles, people who have differences in the way they understand communication, people who have differences in the way they understand social interaction, people who understand abstract concepts very differently from the way we do, learners who have a very sharp single focus, जिसके वजह से उसका लिए generalize करना बहुत ही मुश्किल होता है. तो ये हम सोच ले रहे हैं कि जिन लोग आज इस डिस्कशन में पार्टिसिपेट कर रहे हैं उनको ये समझौता है about autism spectrum disorders. And if we have this understanding of autism, then we will also know that people with autism need to start on their teaching at a very, very early age. जितना जल्दी हम शुरू कर सकते हैं, the better for the child. In creating an inclusive education for children with autism, one of the first things that we have to keep in mind is कि does the child know he has autism? I'm not talking about a child who's say 2 or 3 years old, but by the time the child is 4 or 5, we have to introduce him to the understanding कि हाँ हमारा autism है या हमारा एक autism spectrum disorder है जिसके लिए I need, which makes me a little bit different from other people. I have to remember that if I do not talk to the child about his autism, then he is always going to grow up as somebody who believes there's something sad, terrible, different about him. ये बहुत ही ज़रूरी है कि जब किसी का autism है उसके साथ हम बात करें about their autism, because very soon उनको पता चलता है कि उनमें वो कुछ अलग है नॉन ऑटिस्टिक लोगों से. तो उनके साथ यदि हम उसके ऑटिज्म के बारे में बात करें इन अ मैनर दैट सजेस्ट दैट इट्स ओके टू बी डिफरेंट, कि कुछ लोग अलग होते हैं और वो कोई अजीब बात नहीं है, वो एब्सोल्युटली ओके है, और ऑल्सो ऐसे बात करें कि इट इज़ नॉट समथिंग सैड or tragic to have autism. ये करना बहुत ही ज़रूरी है. And this is particularly true with children who are in mainstream schools, that they know they have autism, they understand what the difficulties are, and that they are comfortable about it. So in inclusion particularly, but in any event, जब हम कोई ऑटिस्टिक पर्सन के साथ बात कर रहे हैं या उनको सिखा रहे हैं, एज विद एनी अदर स्पेशल नीड, वी हैव टू टॉक टू देम अबाउट देयर condition, the fact that they have autism. Next, we have to create an autism friendly environment where they have the right to be different, right? So they are in a school environment where being different is not something strange or something weird, जहाँ पर differences रहना is all right. And the other thing जो बहुत important है in an autism friendly environment है is that कि स्टाफ जो है वो वेल ट्रेंड है फॉर इंक्लूजन, क्योंकि स्टाफ को यदि ऑटिज्म का क्लियर अंडरस्टैंडिंग नहीं है और वो इंक्लूजन के बारे वेल ट्रेंड नहीं है, then they will not be able to do a very good job. So it is very important that staff have the necessary training for inclusion. The other thing for an autism friendly environment, and when I say autism friendly, हम ये भी मीन कर रहे हैं कि कोई भी स्पेशल नीड्स के लिए ये ज़रूरी है कि स्टूडेंट्स के साथ एक सेंसिटाइजेशन अवेयरनेस क्रिएशन हुआ है जिसके वजह से दे आर एबल टू वेलकम people who are different. That is what I meant about being respect and their right to be different. So the students have to have that understanding and awareness of people who are different. And this has to also go into not only the teachers and the students, but the families of the non-autistic students or the students who don't have any other special need. उन सब के family के साथ ये करना बहुत ज़रूरी होता है. Because if they don't have that awareness and that understanding, what usually happens is that people view the people with special needs in the school as कुछ अजीब लोग, और वो अपने बच्चे को भी वो सिखाएंगे कि वो सब अजीब बच्चे जो अपने क्लास में है. तो जब हम ऑटिज्म फ्रेंडली एनवायरनमेंट के बारे बात करते हैं या एक डिसेबल्ड फ्रेंडली एनवायरनमेंट के बारे बात कर रहे हैं, वी हैव टू कीप दिस इन माइंड दैट द एनवायरनमेंट हैज टू बी प्रिपेयर्ड नॉट ओनली इन टर्म्स ऑफ टीचिंग मेथड्स but also in terms of the attitudes, क्योंकि सबसे बड़ा जो barrier रहता है towards inclusion, it is the attitude that people have towards people with special needs. So then the adaptations and accommodations required are less physical and more to do with resistance that people have. What do I mean by this? जैसे हम पहले ही बोले हैं, जब कोई व्हीलचेयर बाउंड रहता है या कोई फिजिकल डिसेबिलिटीज रहता है, हम सोचते हैं इन टर्म्स ऑफ अ लिफ्ट और अ रैम्प, और इवन फॉर पीपल हु आर हियरिंग इम्पेयर्ड, मे बी साइन लैंग्वेज और cochlear implants, or people who are visually impaired, braille computers, typewriters, braille books. तो ये physical adaptations are something that even school authorities are pretty open to doing. But autism में more than these kinds of adaptations, physical adaptation का भी ज़रूरत होता है. But because these are adaptations that require a mind shift, teachers कभी or school also often एक mental block रहता है, एक resistance रहता है. And ये याद रहना है कि जैसे हम एक रैम्प डालने में या ब्रेल बुक्स रखने में we are open to it, the things that we need to do for autism, those are the accommodations and adaptations that are required to help these children cope with life in a school. हमें ये भी याद रखना है, as I start now talking about what the exact adaptations and accommodations that are required, ये याद रखना है कि हर चाइल्ड अलग होते हैं, हर चाइल्ड में ऑटिज्म का मैनिफेस्टेशन एक तरीके का नहीं होता है. So we have to be aware that every child will not show every difficulty and not to the same extent as one child does. They'll all be different. But the most important thing to learn is that all can learn. Every child is capable of learning. There is no child with autism or any other special need who cannot learn. All right, now to get down to the nitty-gritty. I've been giving a basic general introduction on understanding inclusion because it is a very important thing to understand. But now what I would like to talk about more is what are the things we actually need to do, which are the areas in which people with autism actually have difficulties in a mainstream classroom, and what are the things that we can do to help them. Okay, to start with, one is an information overload. Most people with autism have various sensory difficulties. I am, for instance, right now in the studio sitting in front of a camera, and there are these 3 huge fluorescent lights pointed at me. I'm having a little bit of difficulty, but I'm able to cope with it. मगर बहुत ऑटिस्टिक लोग होते हैं जिनके लिए ये लाइट भी कोप करना, the strength of the fluorescent lights is very difficult. Also because ये जो fluorescent light रहता है इसमें कुछ flickers रहता है जो आम आदमी को दिखाई नहीं देता है, हमें दिखाई नहीं देता है, आपको नहीं दिखाई देता है. शायद दिखाई देगा जब वो लाइट थोड़ा सा खराब होते चला है, तब थोड़ा सा फ्लिकर रहता है. बट मैनी पीपल विथ ऑटिज्म को ये फ्लिकर महसूस होता है, और उसके लिए टू सिट इन दिस स्ट्रॉन्ग ब्राइट लाइट दैट फॉर देम इज अ फ्लिकरिंग लाइट कैन बी वेरी वेरी डिफिकल्ट. सो ऐसा सेंसरी ओवरलोड उन लोग का काफ़ी रहता है. तो उसमें तो एक तो इंफॉर्मेशन ओवरलोड रहता है जब हम क्लासरूम में रहते हैं, बिकॉज लोग हम बोलते बहुत, तो काफ़ी तरीके का. एक तो होता है विजुअल ओवरलोड, ऑडिटरी ओवरलोड, टैक्टाइल ओवरलोड. सो व्हेन आई टॉक अबाउट विजुअल ओवरलोड, व्हाट आर द थिंग्स दैट वी हैव? Imagine a regular classroom, right? Class में क्या होता है? There are all these people over there, children in different, they're moving. There is all that movement, constant movement happening. If I put my hand in front of my eyes and do this, the kind of feeling that I get, that is what the child with autism feels when there are kids standing up, sitting down, opening desks, teacher moving around. There are all kinds of things that are happening. And it can be very difficult for a child with autism to deal with all that visual overload that happens. Also, they have to be constantly focused on looking at the bags, pulling out timetables. Kids with autism have a lot of wonderful strengths, but they also have certain difficulties that are different from the difficulties you or I might feel, the non-autistic people feel. And one of them is, for instance, scanning a complete week's timetable. और वीक्स टाइम टेबल में क्या रहता है? 5 days का, all those classes. So there are all that stuff written on the timetable. To look at it, figure out which is Tuesday's timetable, and look what I have to do today. It's not a question of intellectual lack of ability. It's nothing to do with that. It's simply a difficulty in processing the visual overload. ये बच्चे शायद बहुत intelligent होते हैं, मगर कुछ बच्चे could be above average intelligent, but ये जो visual overload के साथ deal करना can be very difficult for many children with autism. So then what can we do? For instance, the timetables. I'll just give a few examples in specific areas. 2 घंटे में it is not possible to cover everything about inclusion, but we will give some broad suggestions. So rather than giving a full week's timetable, the child can have that, जैसे सब बच्चे के पास है उसके भी बैग में वो रह सकता है. उसके साथ साथ we could give a day's timetable. So a day's timetable this is for say Tuesday, and he can have just one strip of the day's timetable in his bag. So when he comes to school, उसके पास पूरा week का timetable है, मगर साथ साथ he can just pull out the day's timetable. And with many children, not only do they just pull it out and have it, they can keep it on their table in front of them. So it is there, and it helps them to focus on क्या करना है. And you might think कि what's the big deal? ये करने का क्या ज़रूरत है? But that is what autism is all about, that they need this to help them get organized. So I can give the child a simple timetable like this for the day. 5 दिन का timetable, सवेरे जब आता है, he can take it out of his bag and he can give it. This is something that we can share with parents कि घर से वो लोग, if the teacher doesn't have time, the parent can make one and give it to the child to bring along with him or her to school. We can make it a little more clear by doing things like, I don't know if this will show on the screen, but we can have a timetable like this where we have Tuesday here, and there's English, math, history, recess, and art and science, and each one has a little like a mnemonic. So English maybe has ABC, math has 1, 2, 3, history has a star, maybe history is a subject that the child likes a lot, so it can be coded. It's what we call coding, coded with a star. Art could have, maybe the child likes drawing scenery. So I can have a tree for the art, and for history, science, I could have a formula, a scientific formula like H2O, right? And what happens is for the child, when he looks at it, he just sees the ABC, which is highlighted, and he knows instantly, I have English now. It's just simplifying things. I think I should add here now that for a person with autism who has a different way of understanding communication from the way we do, a different social understanding, a lot of sensory overload, उन लोग के लिए कभी life can be very, very difficult. So the idea is to make things as simple as possible without compromising in the way they learn. So I have a simple timetable. Sometimes what people can also do is code every day. And when you code every day, for English you might have blue, for math you might have pink, history green, art, science. In some schools क्या करते हैं कि बच्चे को बोलते हैं इंग्लिश किताब में ये कलर के कवर रहेगा. They tell the whole class. These are schools that have made accommodation for children with special needs. So what they have said is, okay, if the child has a difficulty, we will make the accommodation, and the whole class English kitab में blue color के cover रखेंगे. So the child looks at this and he just has to pull out the blue book out of his bag, and he has his English book. For math he might have pink, history green, art के लिए yellow, science के लिए orange. And schools have made those kinds of accommodations. These are schools that are trying very hard to be as accommodating of different kinds of special needs. Sometimes instead of having the whole book covered, you can just have, so this is the English book, or you may have, this is the math book, this could be science. So you just have a little coding at the corner. This could be history, ये हो सकता है art. तो ये छोटा कॉर्नर में एक कोडिंग दे दिए हैं जिसके वजह से the child just looks at it and pulls it out, because sometimes you have to pull it and look at it, right? कहाँ पर लिखा है English or math, and this makes it much simpler for the child. And it is not only for the child with autism. There are many very hyperactive kids who have ADHD. They are also helped. उन लोग को भी ऐसा coding रहेगा. It makes it very easy for them. You'll have a lot of children who have specific learning disability who also benefit from this kind of a coding. So ये खाली autistic बच्चे के लिए नहीं, autistic बच्चे को बहुत मदद होता है, मगर बहुत सारे और बच्चे हैं जिनका specific needs है जिसको इससे help मिल सकता है. We can also do something about the seating. जो बच्चे visually बहुत overstimulated हो जाते हैं उनके लिए we can make them sit away from the window, right? Window के पास हम बैठाएंगे, so obviously the child will be easily distracted, जिसका visual overstimulation होता है. हम उसको दरवाजे के पास में नहीं बैठाएंगे because then also उसका overstimulation हो सकता है. Somebody who is very visually overstimulated, उसके लिए one of the best places to sit would be in front of the class. क्योंकि जब हम फर्स्ट रो में बैठ रहे हैं तो हमारे सामने और बहुत सारे बच्चे नहीं हैं जो उठ रहे हैं, बैठ रहे हैं, झांक कर नीचे से बैग उठा रहे हैं, टर्न करके दूसरे बच्चे से बात कर रहे हैं, डेस्क का कवर उठा रहे हैं, किताबें इधर उधर कर रहे हैं. ये जो विजुअल ओवर स्टिम्युलेशन कट आउट हो जाता है इफ द चाइल्ड इज सिटिंग राइट इन फ्रंट of the teacher or in the front row. So this is a simple way of structuring so that the seating is in front और बच्चे के लिए focus करना काफी आसान हो जाता है. Then you also have auditory overload, and that is, of course, there is a lot of auditory overload that there is nothing that you can do about, and the child will learn to adapt. All the noise, a lot of children get very stressed out by the noise of books being pulled out, desks being shut. जब classes change होता है, you move from math to science, for instance, math book bag में डाला जाता है, desk से science का किताब निकाला जाता है, हमारा experiment का चीज़ निकाले जाते हैं, rulers निकाले हैं. So वो जो सब आवाज़ होता रहता है, rustling of papers, see the noise that paper makes, ये सब can be extremely stressful for many children with autism. Some children, they learn to, during breaks, just put some cotton wool in their ears so that the noise is not stressing them. Or jab class sip shuru ho raha, they take it out of their ears. So you can do simple things like that. But more than that, what we can also do is, this is at transition. एक क्लास से जब दूसरा क्लास में ट्रांजिशन हो रहा है. बट इन एडिशन टू दैट, अगेन हम उसको एक क्वाइट एरिया में बैठा सकते हैं, एंड परहैप्स द फ्रंट ऑफ द क्लास अगेन विल बी अ क्वाइट एरिया, नॉट जस्ट द फ्रंट इन राइट इन फ्रंट ऑफ द टीचर, बट फ्रंट रो में कोने में यदि बैठे तो वहां पर ऑडिटरी डिस्ट्रैक्शंस काफी कम हो सकता है. सो मेकिंग द चाइल्ड सिट राइट इन फ्रंट इन अ कॉर्नर वुड परहैप्स बी अ वेरी गुड आइडिया. ऑल्सो गिविंग क्लियर इंस्ट्रक्शंस. हम जब बच्चे के साथ बात करते हैं, कभी कभी हम जब इंस्ट्रक्शंस देते हैं, दे कैन बी वेरी कॉम्प्लेक्स, बट आई थिंक आई विल कम टू मोर ऑफ दैट लेटर. Basically about speaking clearly, but I think we'll cover that later. And finally, they also have a lot of tactile overload. So some of them may not want to wear long pants as soon as winter comes. स्कूल यूनिफॉर्म में शॉर्ट से लॉन्ग पैंट्स में शिफ्ट होते हैं या लॉन्ग पैंट्स से शॉर्ट्स में शिफ्ट करते हैं. बहुत ऑटिस्टिक बच्चे को वो शिफ्ट करना मुश्किल होता है, और पर्टिकुलरली लॉन्ग पैंट्स पहनने में, नहीं, कुछ का लॉन्ग पैंट्स पहनने में और कुछ का शॉर्ट्स. एक्चुअली मेनी ऑफ देम हैव डिफिकल्टी इन वेयरिंग शॉर्ट्स बिकॉज वो जो हेम रहता है वो थाइस के साथ रब करता है. सो परहैप्स द स्कूल कुड ऑल्सो लुक एट permitting the child to change the uniform a little bit later rather than insisting he change right away. Again, like I said earlier, कि हर बच्चे अलग होते हैं और हर बच्चे सीखते हैं. शुरू में in the initial primary years ये सब चीज़ कुछ ज़्यादा करना होगा. But as the child grows and as their social understanding changes, वो अपने आप ही कोशिश करेगा और ज़्यादा कोशिश करेगा दूसरे बच्चे के साथ चेंज करने के लिए. मगर जब इनिशियल ईयर्स में, जब वो नर्सरी में क्लास 1, 2, 3 में है, ये सब हमको थोड़ा ज़्यादा ध्यान देने का ज़रूरत होता है. और एक बात जो हमें याद रखना है कि पीपल विथ ऑटिज्म, उनके लर्निंग स्टाइल्स काफ़ी हमारे लर्निंग स्टाइल से अलग होते हैं. Many of you will already know that, but to just reiterate again, उनके learning styles काफ़ी literal होते हैं, right? So हम उसका communication का जो समझौता होता है, किताब में जो पढ़ते हैं, ये सब का understanding काफ़ी literal होता है. They do move to a more abstract style of understanding with time. जैसे वो सीखते हैं आस्ते आस्ते, they do move to a more abstract style, but in the early years, for early learners, उनका अंडरस्टैंडिंग बहुत ही लिटरल होता है. ये तो खाली लर्निंग स्टाइल की बात नहीं है, ये कम्युनिकेशन का भी बात है, बट मे बी वी विल टॉक अबाउट दैट अ लिटिल बिट लेटर. लेट मी मूव ऑन टू सिंगल फोकस. पीपल विथ ऑटिज्म आर पीपल हु हैव वेरी स्ट्रांग सिंगल फोकस. वो एक चीज़ के ऊपर बहुत इंटेंसली और शार्पली फोकस कर सकते हैं. ये एक तरीके का स्ट्रेंथ भी है. उसीलिए जो पीपल विथ ऑटिज्म जिसका मेन स्ट्रीम एजुकेशन मिलना, दे हैव बीन फॉर्चुनेट इनफ टू गेट मेन स्ट्रीम एजुकेशन, उन लोग के लिए गेटिंग जॉब्स इन रिसर्च और एनी वर्क जहाँ पर बहुत फोकस देकर काम करना है, दे डू वेरी वेरी वेल. दे मेक एक्सट्रीमली गुड रिसर्चर्स. बट इसमें एक डिफिकल्टी क्या आता है कि जनरलाइजेशन का डिफिकल्टी. अगेन आई एम श्योर मेनी ऑफ यू नो अबाउट दैट, बट टू जस्ट गिव एन एग्जाम्पल, कुछ बच्चे होंगे आप उसको कलर्स के बारे यदि टेबल टॉप में सिखाए हैं, राइट? वो टेबल टॉप में सीखेगा, आप उसको बैठकर पूछिएगा कि कुछ कार्ड्स लेकर कि ये कौन सा कलर है रेड, ये कौन सा कलर है ग्रीन, ये कौन सा है ब्लू. मगर आप एनवायरनमेंट में उसको बोले कि वहाँ पर से ब्लू किताब ले आओ, वो नहीं कर पाएगा. सो एक सिचुएशन में कर पाएगा मगर दूसरे सिचुएशन में नहीं कर पाएगा. और इवन दे may know numbers very well. They might pick up numbers and learn numbers at the table. और वो 1, 2, 3, 4 बहुत अच्छा करके सीख लिया है. But when they go out into the environment और आप बोलते हैं हमें किचन से 2 स्पून ले आओ, नहीं कर पाएगा. सो सिंगल फोकस इतना ज़्यादा है कि वो एक तरीके में सीखेगा, मगर उसको दूसरा एनवायरनमेंट में, दूसरा सिचुएशन में, दूसरा लोग के साथ अप्लाई करने में मुश्किल होगा. एंड दिस इज समथिंग वेरी टिपिकल ऑफ people with autism. So this is a strength as well as the opposite side can work as a difficulty. They also have very, very strong memory, right? So when you have a very strong memory, it is like, say, I'll give you an example. I think एक example देने से ये काफ़ी clear हो जाएगा. An example that most of us understand. जो लोग जिनके hearing impairment है, right? उनके लिए अब हम देखते हैं, मेरे जो फ्रेंड्स हैं जिसका हियरिंग इम्पेयरमेंट है, देयर मेमोरी बिकम्स वेरी स्ट्रांग एंड ऑल्सो देयर हियरिंग. एंड व्हाट हैपन्स इज दे compensate for their not being able to see by using their memory. So उनको एक जगह से दूसरा जगह जाना है, we know by looking, they have it clearly in their head कि मेरा बेड से मेरा बाथरूम का दरवाज़ा 14 स्टेप्स है, वो कभी नहीं भूलते हैं. हम जब हमारे वर्क प्लेस में पहुंचते हैं, गेट से मेरा बिल्डिंग का दरवाज़ा 20 स्टेप्स है, बिल्डिंग का दरवाजे से 5 स्टेयर्स है, 5 स्टेयर्स से अनदर 30 स्टेप्स के बाद लिफ्ट आता है. राइट टर्न करके लिफ्ट से हम ऊपर जाकर जब निकलते हैं, बाएं टर्न करके 15 स्टेप्स जाकर राइट टर्न करके 2 स्टेप्स लेकर मेरा टेबल है. दे डोंट फॉरगेट. That's what my friends who are visually impaired tell me, that they use their memory. Similarly, people with autism have extremely intensely strong memory and they use that a lot. And sometimes क्या होता है, जब उसका ये generalization नहीं होता है, जब उनका सिखाने का तरीका में जो सिखा रहे हैं उनको ये समझौता नहीं है कि उसका शायद जनरलाइजेशन हमको देखना है, सो तब वो करते हैं कि अपना रोट मेमोरी को यूज़ करते हैं, उसका स्ट्रॉन्ग मेमोरी को यूज़ करके एक कोपिंग मैकेनिज्म हिसाब से यूज़ करते हैं. मगर तब क्या होता है कि ट्रू लर्निंग नहीं होता है. जितना दिन रोट मेमोरी से चल जाए वो चला लेते हैं, मगर बाद में मुश्किल आ जाता है. तो ये हमें बहुत क्लियरली ध्यान रखना है दैट दे हैव अ डिफिकल्टी with generalization because उसका बहुत सिंगल फोकस है, and they have very strong memories and they use that. जब बहुत छोटे बच्चे हैं वो बोल नहीं सकते हैं कि हमारा ये concept clear नहीं है, right? So then they try to use the rote memory to get by. So this is a part of the learning style of people with autism जो हमको याद रखना बहुत ज़रूरी है. अगेन हम जो अब अर्लियर बोल रहे थे कि उनका लिटरल अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ कम्युनिकेशन है, तो जब हम लिटरल अंडरस्टैंडिंग बोलते हैं इन स्कूल्स, इन इंक्लूसिव स्कूल्स, ऑल ऑफ अस वी टेंड टू यूज अ लॉट ऑफ मेटाफॉर्स, आयरनी, सरकाज़म, वो उनको समझ में नहीं आता है. उसका अंडरस्टैंडिंग कॉन्क्रीट है, तो टीचर के लिए बहुत ज़रूरी है कि क्लियर कॉन्क्रीट कम्युनिकेशन यूज़ करें. इन lower classes with younger children, with many non-autistic children, उनके लिए भी clear concrete communication बहुत ज़रूरी होता है, because उनके भी तभी understanding काफ़ी literal रहता है, मगर autistic बच्चे के लिए तब बहुत ज़रूरी होता है. So in the early years ये literal understanding के वजह से हमारा communication को बहुत concrete रखना ज़रूरी होता है. कभी कभी टीचर्स क्लास में आकर बोलते हैं, सपोजिंग बच्चे बहुत बात कर रहे हैं, राइट, और टीचर क्लास में कुछ टाइम सुनकर फिर बोलते हैं, क्या आप लोग को काम करने का मन है या नहीं. ना यदि हम इसको बहुत लिटरली लेते हैं, तब ये एक क्या आपको काम करने का मन है या नहीं, इट इज अ क्वेश्चन, राइट. नाउ द टीचर इज नॉट सीइंग इट एज अ क्वेश्चन, द टीचर इज एक्चुअली सेइंग ठीक से काम करो, स्टॉप टॉकिंग, मगर वो बोल रहे हैं क्या आपको काम करने का मन है या नहीं. नाउ फॉर द चाइल्ड विथ ऑटिज्म दिस कैन बी परसीव्ड एज अ क्वेश्चन, और वो सोच सकता है कि नहीं काम करने का मन नहीं है, तो हम किताब को बंद करके रख दिए. देन टीचर गोज देन गेट्स वेरी एंग्री कि हम अभी काम करने बोले और फिर आप बैठे हो ऐसे किताब बंद करके. बट द पॉइंट इज कि टीचर का कम्युनिकेशन वॉज नॉट कॉन्क्रीट. So we have to use a lot of concrete communication with kids with autism. अगेन वी डोंट हैव टू डू इट ऑल देयर लाइव्स, मगर अर्ली ईयर्स में विथ अर्ली लर्नर्स ये करना बहुत ही ज़रूरी है टू कीप अ कम्युनिकेशन कॉन्क्रीट सो देयर इज़ नो मिसअंडरस्टैंडिंग. बिकॉज टीचर्स often don't realize this and they tend to communicate with metaphors or in a very sarcastic manner, the child with autism does not get it and he gets into trouble not because वो disobedient बच्चा है but because उसका communication का understanding कुछ अलग है और teacher उसको अपना understanding में नहीं रखा है and has just given an instruction जो has been confusing for the child. The other thing हमको याद रखना है कि people with autism tend to speak in a very flat tone of voice. हम जब यहाँ पर बात कर रहे हैं, there is a lot of tonal inflection in my voice, right? Like the way I say right or I change what I say. So there is a lot of tonal inflection. The child with autism may not have this. He may tend to speak in a very flat tone of voice. नहीं हमको नहीं जाना है, हमको ये नहीं करना है. And to the person who does not understand autism, it almost appears like rudeness. But the child is not trying to be rude. He is just speaking in a way that he speaks. He has difficulty with tonal inflection. They don't have the tonal inflection in their voices. Only a small percentage of people with autism use a lot of tonal inflection. A vast majority do not. Many of them जो mainstream schools में है, they do use tonal inflection to some extent, but not the way that somebody who does not have autism does. हाँ, नॉन ऑटिस्टिक लोग जैसे करते हैं वैसे नहीं है. सो ये जो फ्लैट वॉइस में बात करते हैं इसको थोड़ा ध्यान रखना है, बिकॉज इन आवर एक्सपीरियंस टीचर्स ऑफन गेट वेरी ऑफेंडेड और गुस्से में आ जाते हैं, कैसे करके हमसे बात कर रहे हैं देखो, बट द चाइल्ड इज नॉट ट्राइंग टू बी रूड और एनी ऑफ दैट. They also have a difficulty in controlling the volume. So they will say everything in this somewhat loudish tone of voice. अभी कहाँ पर जाएंगे टीचर? He's not trying to be angry. That's the way he speaks. That's because he has autism. It's like somebody who has blind. If he's trying to find his way and he happens to touch you by accident, he's not trying to be rude. That's an accident because he is blind and he was just trying to figure out where you are. Similarly, when the child with autism speaks in that tone of voice, he's not trying to be rude. Autism is often perceived as bad behavior because of the way it manifests. And as teachers who are thinking in terms of working in inclusive setups, it is very important that we keep in mind that that is what autism is all about.
पहले ज़माने में हम कहते थे कि ऑटिज्म इज अ रिजल्ट ऑफ बैड पेरेंटिंग.
हाँ, कि
जब पेरेंट्स ठीक ठाक इनको बड़ा नहीं किया, इनको ठीक से शिक्षा नहीं दिया, इसलिए इतना जोर से बोलता, इतना बदतमीजी कुछ करता है, लगता वैसा है. एज मेरी ने जैसे समझाया कि वो पुराने ज़माने का ख्यालात था, आजकल भी हैव अ न्यूरोलॉजिकल बेस इनके. तो ये इनका अपना जैसे मेरी ने कहा कि जो पीपल विद विजुअल इम्पेयरमेंट है वो कभी धक्का लग जाता है, कभी टेबल से, कभी कुर्सी से, कभी किसी से, कभी टेबल से लगा तो कुछ गिर गया या किसी इंसान से धक्का लगा. ये इट्स जस्ट वन ऑफ दोज थिंग्स दैट इज पार्ट ऑफ द कंडीशन दैट दे वर्क विद. एंड
आई थिंक दैट्स अ वेरी वेरी वैलिड पॉइंट, क्योंकि this is one of the biggest difficulties जो mainstream schools में होते हैं, that people find it very hard. And अभी भी there is a lot of there's a strong belief that parenting का कुछ aspect है. अभी भी इंडिया में there is a strong belief. We encounter that कि वो पेरेंट्स तो वैसे है ना, वो काम पे चले जाते हैं वैसे बच्चे, उसीलिए बच्चे वैसे
ठीक से सिखाया नहीं.
And also, you know, the point that you made about the person who's visually impaired जो थोड़ा धक्का मार के कभी चले जाते. People with autism also do that sometimes. Again, because उनका वो social understanding थोड़ा अलग होते हैं, and they don't understand that ये जो private space. So teaching them about private space is very important. तो वो कभी-कभी नहीं समझते हैं, and teachers get very offended कि कैसा लड़का है, ऐसा करके एकदम पास से चला गया,
बहुत नजदीक से आकर बात करता है,
बहुत नजदीक से आकर बात करता है. So ये होता रहता है, और I'm glad you brought that point up because it's a very very important point.
कभी लड़कियां भी offended हो जाते हैं क्योंकि अभी
हाँ,
बिकॉज उनके पास
ऐसे किए हैं।
ये लड़की लड़के का कॉन्सेप्ट हमेशा नहीं रहता है,
Right,
तो
right.
कभी बहुत नजदीक से आके बात करते हैं और टीचर के नजदीक में आके बात करते हुए व्हाट इज द रीजन फॉर दैट, उसके लिए क्या होता है?
See, because they don't see, autism is primarily a social impairment, right? And the part of the brain जहाँ से हमको ये social understanding आता है कि हम आपसे कुछ बोलना है तो हम because I know you well, हम काफी पास से बोल सकते हैं. Now if a gentleman was sitting here who I don't know, कुछ पूछना है, so I will just ask from here. But वो gentleman यदि मेरा brother होते थे तो I would lean forward and speak. तो these subtleties ये हमको कोई सिखाते नहीं हैं, ये कोई पेरेंट्स कभी नहीं सिखाते हैं, ये हम ऑटोमेटिकली जान जाते हैं. मगर द पार्ट ऑफ दैट ब्रेन जिसको ये रेगुलेट करते हैं विद पीपल विद ऑटिज्म, दैट पार्ट ऑफ द ब्रेन इज डिफरेंट. सो दे डोंट अंडरस्टैंड दिस. वो ये हमको उसको सिखाना होता है. हम सिखाते हैं बाय रोट दैट व्हेन यू स्पीक टू समबडी हु यू डोंट नो टू वेल और हुज योर नॉट अ रिलेटिव, थोड़ा सा दूर से करना है, वी हैव टू टीच देम दैट. वी ऑल्सो हैव टू टीच देम कि जब हम आप जाने मांगते हैं, रास्ता नहीं है, आप खड़े होकर बोलोगे एक्सक्यूज मी एंड देन यू गो. सो देयर आर वेज ऑफ टीचिंग ऑल दिस, और ये हमको करना होता है, राइट? एंड वेरी एबल पीपल विद ऑटिज्म ऑफन डोंट अंडरस्टैंड. And like there is one example that I often give, like some of them सीखा है how to be polite. So with a lady, when you are polite, उनके हाथ में बहुत सामान है तो you help to carry it. But when you are helping to carry a lady's सामान, आप उनका handbag भी नहीं ले जाओगे. But we have experienced this कि वो हैंडबैग भी ले जाने मांग रहे हैं because he has learned कि लेडी को हेल्प करना मतलब है कि सब कुछ ले जाना है. Now if I was not that accepting, if I was हम बहुत judgmental होते थे तो हम बोलते थे कि कैसा लड़का है मेरा हैंडबैग ले रहा है. But I understood that he's trying to help. He didn't understand that handbag भी नहीं लेते हैं. That's a very personal, private thing. So again that had to be taught. So social rules बहुत complex होते हैं, तो इसीलिए वो सिखाना भी बहुत जरूरी होता है, right?
तो ये सारी subtleties जो हम दूसरे लोगों में, दूसरे बच्चों में हम we take for granted कि वो the way they are brought up देख के सीखते हैं, कुछ automatically social skills acquire करते हैं, वो with persons with autism they have to be taught.
See, one of the things that I said earlier about different learning styles, and yes, I forgot to mention that they may not initially learn very well through imitation.
Okay.
हम बहुत कुछ सीखते हैं थ्रू इमिटेशन. हाउ टू ब्रश माई हेयर, हाउ टू वेयर माई क्लोथ्स, बच्चे सीखते हैं थ्रू इमिटेशन. और बहुत सोशल रूल्स भी. हम जापान में जाएंगे तो हम सीखेंगे थ्रू इमिटेशन. हाउ द जापानीज इज ईटिंग एंड हाउ दे ग्रीट, आई विल वॉच देम एंड आई विल डू द सेम. In the initial years, many of them have difficulty in learning through imitation. But something that I said in the beginning of my presentation, that they eventually learn. And they will learn how to learn through imitation. So they suddenly hit that thing that, oh, हम देख देख कर सीख सकते हैं. And then they start picking up. They may not learn the absolute finer nuances जो हम सीख सकते हैं, बहुत सोशल फाइन. मगर हम में भी बहुत नॉन ऑटिस्टिक पीपल है जो सोशली कुछ इधर उधर गड़बड़ कर देते हैं. बट दे डू लर्न इवेंचुअली टू लर्न थ्रू इमिटेशन. एंड इन फैक्ट समथिंग दैट वी से इज दैट दे इवेंचुअली learn how to learn. With many autistic children in the initial years, they don't know how to learn the way we do. So we have to teach them how to learn. So that is why the early teaching is very, very important. With some of them who are very functionally able, they learn through imitation, they can go into mainstream schools and kind of start off. But even with them, a certain amount of the social teaching to help them know कि हम लोग को देखकर भी सीख सकते हैं, that is very important. So they don't use their body, their usage of body language is again not very strong. और उसीलिए वो लोग का body language से भी बहुत कुछ नहीं समझ पाते हैं जैसे non-autistic लोग समझ पाते हैं. And also people with autism focus better when they are looking away when speaking. तो हम जब किसी से बात कर रहे हैं, हम देखकर बात कर रहे हैं, to look into a person's eyes, उनके आंख पर देखे और क्या बोल रहे हैं वो भी सोचे. बहुत ऑटिस्टिक लोग के लिए वो मुश्किल होता है. तो वेरी ऑफन वो जब बात करते हैं वो आपकी तरफ नहीं देखते हैं, because doing the both can be difficult. Again, it is important in a mainstream situation to be aware of that, क्योंकि teachers कभी सोचते हैं कि ये shifty है, बदमाश है, उसीलिए नहीं देख रहा है, या rude है.
ये होता क्यों है?
Again,
Lack of eye contact?
the brain,
Okay.
and many of them, they teach themselves to look. But we work on that also, but you can't force it. And many of them say कि हमारा लिए हम जब देख रहे हैं, it's like say when I'm doing a workshop, right? And I do workshops all the time. When a thought is not coming, I tend to look up at the ceiling and think. When I'm looking at the people, वो thought मेरा नहीं आता है. I have to look up to get the thought back. So it is a more extreme form of that. That when they're speaking, to look at the person, because when you look at a person, there's a reason. हम जब लोगों के फेस देखकर बात करते हैं ना, लोगों का फेस चेंज करता रहता है. Okay, dealing with that can be too much of a visual this thing for them.
Okay.
So it's easier for them to just look away and speak. So, you know, that's the way their brain is. And if we are talking about inclusion, which means making accommodation and adaptations for all kinds of needs, I have to accept that some of my students may not look at me when they are speaking, and that's all right. As a teacher, it's not something I want to get offended about. And I wanted to stress these because these are questions that often come. Teachers get very offended.
Very, very important.
Very
Yes.
offended.
Yes.
Okay, so when I'm speaking to them, we discussed communication earlier. So एक बात जो हम याद रखना है is to avoid verbal overload. Again, I keep reiterating over and over again कि हम जो सब बोल रहे हैं ये early learners के साथ हम शुरू करेंगे. So by the time the child is a little older, he will be able to handle all this. It is in the initial stages that we have to be very focused on everything that I'm saying, but they also start learning how to deal with all these other things. So verbal overload के माने, for instance, the example I've given there, I know you want to go for art, but you cannot. You can't run off without finishing your lesson. Get it done and then we'll think about your art. For a person with autism, it's just gone. He doesn't know what has been said, particularly for an early learner. So what I have to say is, I know you want to go for art, finish your work, then go for art. Simple, right? It's like, say, even in a home, parents might often say, अच्छा बाहर जाना है तो जल्दी जल्दी जूता पहनकर खाना खाकर चलो हम जाएंगे. The child hasn't really picked up anything from that. He may have caught on to one word, juta, and he knows अच्छा बाहर जाना है. But the real whole communication in the sentences he hasn't caught on. So it's important to avoid verbal overload. Make everything we say, break it down into more simple steps, simple sentences. And again, like I had said earlier, I won't use sarcasm, metaphors, irony. I can do that as the children progress. They become more advanced learners. मगर early learners के साथ हम वो नहीं करने मांगेंगे. Again, I had talked about communication in some detail. Social understanding. People with autism have social understanding that is different from the non-autistic, जिसको हम neurotypical बोलते हैं. Neurotypical से autistic लोगों का social understanding काफी अलग होता है. अभी we discussed one aspect of that, and they need very before getting to what they need, let me talk about the fact that they have difficulties with joint attention. They have let me get into that. Okay, they need very clear rules because their understanding, social understanding, is different from ours. They need very, very clear rules. So for instance, if the child tends to come up and stand very close to the teacher and ask things, rather than saying, don't stand so close to me, the teacher can say, you can stand behind the desk and talk to me. So give a very clear, concrete kind of a instruction for the child to follow. If the child tends to push past other children when going out, well, pushing past all children do, but push past a teacher, we can tell the child, when the teacher is there, you will wait, the teacher will go, and then you will go. So we can give very clear, specific rules. If the child brings his exercise book and doesn't know you've said, give me the exercise book. So he comes and he hands it onto you, puts it onto your lap. He might even do that for an early learner. You've got to tell the child कि जब आपका काम खत्म होगा, you can come and put it on the corner of my table. You can put one exercise book there आगे से and say इसके ऊपर छोड़ के जाना. So it makes it very, very clear and it makes it easier for them to follow as well. One very important aspect is the area of joint attention. People who are on the spectrum, who have an autism spectrum disorder, उनके लिए following instructions in a group is difficult. Again, it's not something that they can't learn, they can, but शुरू में they will have difficulties, and this is something that, barring a very small percentage, the rest will have difficulties, and this is something that we can be aware of. So what are some of the joint attention situations? जैसे कि क्लास में टीचर बोलते हैं, okay everyone take out your history books, चलो सब कोई हिस्ट्री किताब निकालो. Now for the person with autism, मेरा नाम तो everyone नहीं है, सब कोई कौन है, हम तो मेरी है. So he will keep sitting, and this is a typical situation. The teacher thinks this child is, disobedient or something, but actually he hasn't understood, because as far as he's concerned, you have to say the child's name is Rahul. Rahul, take out your exercise book. So one of the things we suggest is take the child's name, but don't only take the child's name, because वो फिर stigmatizing हो जाता है. हम हर पूरा क्लास को बोल रहे हैं कि अच्छा किताब निकाल लो, राहुल किताब निकालो, हर बार यदि करे, then it kind of brands him, isolates him. So it's much better to do something like take the name of a few other kids and just make sure you have Rahul included most times. So you say, everybody take out your history books, Rahul, Smita, Tarun, history books out. Rahul has got it. Just feed that word into it. For a very young child, say who's 5 or so, you could take his name, give a little pause and give the instruction, because he's still very young and all this thing of stigmatizing is still a bit way off. But joint attention is something that we have to be aware of. Saying that class over, go for music. The child wouldn't understand he's also supposed to go for music. वो सोचेगा किसी को जाना है, उसका लिए नहीं है. So we have to take the child's name in some form or draw the child's attention in some manner, right? And tell him. हम शायद बोले, okay everybody for music, and I'm walking down the class, I can just tap the student on his back and say music. So he instantly knows अच्छा हमें भी जाना है. So joint attention is something that we have to be very aware of. I also have to remember to structure free time. Recess is for a person with an autism spectrum disorder. Recess is one of the most stressful times during school. Why? Because during school hours, he has a timetable that tells him exactly क्या होना है. He needs those clarity, just like I showed the earlier timetable that tells them exactly क्या होना है through the day. So recess doesn't tell him really क्या करना है. Class में बैठकर teacher बोल देते हैं किताब निकालो, ये लिखो, बोर्ड से करो. So it all becomes very clear for him. But for recess, there is nothing like that. So that again becomes pretty confusing for the child. So what we have to do during recess is, and okay, the other thing is that during recess, वो बच्चे को बाहर जाना है, playground में जाना है, दूसरे बच्चे के साथ socially interact करना है. And like I said when I started, that I'm assuming कि everybody who's participating in this discussion, सबको autism के बारे basic का understanding है. So obviously to go out and interact in a social context with people on the playground is going to be very difficult for the child with autism. So one of the things that we will have to do is that perhaps ensure that the child has something to do during recess time that does not involve his having to interact with other children. वो नहीं करने का ज़रूरत होए. Over a period of time, many of them do make friends and they do start playing with other children. But till such time, बहुत ज़रूरी है कि उसका लिए we have something else that the child can do. We can have something like a choice book in which we have a few things that the child could choose to do. And the teacher can decide कि आज वो ये और ये कर सकता है. So we can have a number of things like a puzzle, playing in the sand pit for a young child, झूला हो सकता है for a very young child, doing puzzles, reading a book, going to the library, you can have a card saying library, so he can have a choice because recess is a free time, right? जो जहाँ पर बच्चे जो मर्जी वो कर सकते हैं. Now, since the child with autism can't go into the playground and play with the other children, we can give him a choice where he chooses amongst an array of 2 or 3 things what he can do. So he can pick one of those out and go and spend his time wherever he wants to be.
You're saying, Mary, sorry to interrupting, supposing the other kids are playing football or whatever games or hop, skip and jump
Right,
or
right.
whatever, hopscotch, hai?
Right.
So
Hopscotch, yeah.
these kind of games, whether they are in rural schools or in urban schools, they are part of the growing up process of most kids. Now, are you saying that for kids with autism, initially other kids may not involve them or they may not want to be involved?
Both. Initially, both plus one more thing. Other kids may not involve them. Also, to go and play football in recess, not during sports time. Sports time, there is a master who's regulating them. Recess, you have to make these little connections and decide. That can be very difficult, and that is the time when bullying happens the most. Huge amount of bullying hota hai because they don't understand exactly what is happening. So it is very important. Those are the 2 things. The other thing is that many people with autism, and this is interesting, jitna functionally able hota hai na, they often have poor motor skills. जो very functionally able people with autism है,
Coordination skills, a lot of them have the ball uthana,
फेंकना, kicking it correctly.
अच्छा.
So they tend to be very poor in sports. Not all. I keep stressing, सब कोई वैसा नहीं होता है, but a lot of them.
Is that, eye-hand coordination, eye-foot coordination, foot-hand coordination, all kinds of coordination problems?
Different kids have different kind of difficulties. You will find that many of them have a lot of difficulty. We've seen very functionally able ones who are working in offices. हम कुर्सी में उठकर बल्ब चेंज करते हैं ना, they can't do that. Because कुर्सी में, that balance, they are fabulous sitting at the computer and doing all their work, but वो नहीं कर पा रहे हैं. तो ये coordination का, balance का कभी-कभी difficulties भी रहता है. That could be another aspect. But having said that, ऐसा भी people with autism है who are very good at sports.
But you are saying that under a master, जब sports class session में master होते हैं, rules होते हैं, तुम यहाँ खड़े हो, वो खड़े हो, वहाँ पे वो
they may find it easy. शायद. They may find it easy if there are no coordination problems. If it is only an issue of social difficulties, तब वहाँ पर they will manage. But if it is also a coordination problem, then they won't be able to manage. Just like some people are very bad at football.
Of course.
So some of them might not be very good at stuff like that. But playground में, recess में क्या होता है, ये जो social interaction का time होता है, and in fact, experience has shown that that is the time जहाँ पर maximum difficulties होता है for people with autism, because bullying becomes extreme, and because they have a very literal understanding of things, they also have not a very clear understanding of other people's minds. I'll talk a little bit about that. And so they get to be very taken advantage of by kids.
Other kids.
They can be hugely intelligent and yet extremely gullible. So that is the problem in recess. Because recess में it's not just play. People sit and chat, they figure out you have these difficulties, and the bullying becomes extreme. And that is why in many schools it has been found simpler to just give them something to do. And if they're doing something in the library or they want to go cycling around, which is something, an individual sport, it's an easier thing to do than something जहाँ पर बहुत social interaction का ज़रूरत होगा. अकेले छोटा ग्रुप में. See, that is why cycling, roller skating, swimming, those are wonderful sports for people with autism.
So teachers को इस वक्त ये जो प्रॉब्लम है आप कह रहे हैं, तो ये तो बहुत बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है. इसको टाइड ओवर करने के लिए टीचर को कोशिश करना चाहिए कि 2-1 फ्रेंड्स उसकी हो,
buddying,
एक छोटा ग्रुप में उसे इंट्रोड्यूस करे, फिर आहिस्ता आहिस्ता ग्रुप बड़ा हो.
One of the things we suggest is कि क्लास में, say one of the kids जो काफी अच्छा है, जेंटल है, पढ़ाई में भी अच्छा है, very often you have that combination. Usko, they tell that child to be a buddy with the child with autism,
Right.
and tell them that you want to be around him when he's in the playground. So if you can create good buddies, and you can do that with other special needs also, not just with autism. Creating a buddy system is a wonderful way, and many schools do that. They create a buddy system, and if it is a co-educational school, one of the things that's been found is that girls make very good buddies.
Okay.
Because girls tend to be more gentle and caring and stuff like that. So they tend to make very good buddies, and they'll stand up for the person with autism
Okay.
when social teasing is happening.
Okay.
So yes, a buddy system is a great way of
okay.
keep putting that into
From
motion.
small groups to larger.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. Start with one, and then you can have a little group, so that have little groups. So he becomes a part of that group, and they become friends. Okay, so as I was saying that one of the things that I wanted to mention is that no, I had discussed that. Research being one of the most difficulties type. Okay, there, friendships and buddy there. That's the point that I was trying to look for. That creating friendships, you're going to help them a little bit, but they do end up making good friends depending on the school. Yet if the school, proactive school hota hai, budding ka opportunities deta hai, then the children do make friends. They have friends they go home to, जो उनके घर आते हैं, जो एक साथ काम करते हैं, and they end up having lifelong buddies also. But that budding has to be in most cases facilitated by the school. School को थोड़ा facilitate करना पड़ता है. They also have a need for sameness. So as far as possible, the environment has to be predictable. What I mean by that is, if there is a history class and suddenly it's been cancelled and we're going to have home science or something like that, the student has to be told about that in specific terms. Usually teachers classroom very generally, actually we're not going to have history now, so and so sir is going to come. And the kids have figured out kya hona hai. Okay, the child with autism will have to be told.
पहले से.
That not just कि वो sir आ रहे हैं. आज history अभी नहीं होगा, or not even that. Supposing this is a history class, the teacher comes in and says, okay children, we are not going to have the regular class, आज Sudarshan साहब आ रहे हैं. Now the other kids have figured out that history नहीं होगा, हमारा math होगा or something else होगा. The child with autism will be sitting there with his history book waiting for it to happen and getting very stressed when this other person walks in. So it is important to tell the child that it was supposed to be history now, but we are going to have whatever else, and Sudarshan sir is going to come. So that specific information needs to be given. Again, like I said, this is important for early learners. As they become advanced learners, get into senior classes, they get all this. Okay, but the thing is that जैसे हम बोल रहे थे ब्रेल का ज़रूरत होता है for some people, ramp और lift की ज़रूरत होता है for some other people. This is what you need with people with autism. But the interesting thing is, you may not need all of these things right through their lives. A lot of these things, as they learn, you can do away with. But some of the things you will need to keep on, of course. Like maybe some of them might need to sit in the front of class because of the audio and visual overload that happens in the back of the class. But a lot of these things हमको continuously करने का ज़रूरत नहीं होता है. Also prepare for changes in routine. That is very important as well.
तो आप ये कह रहे हैं कि अगर छोटी छोटी सी भी चीज अगर वो चेंज हो या बदलना हो तो उसको बड़ी
क्लियरली
समझाना पड़ता है, बच्चे को प्रिपेयर करना पड़ता है पहले से कि आज ये नहीं होगा वो होगा इस वजह से वगैरह. आर दे इंटरेस्टेड इन कॉजेशन कि ये क्यों नहीं होगा वो होगा ना? इज इट इनफ टू
जस्ट टू टेल देम what's going to happen? You causation का कोई ज़रूरत ही नहीं है. You don't have to get into why it's not happening. If you just tell them कि ये नहीं होगा ये होगा, good enough. And what often helps is, I never did that, is if I have a thing written down and there's history over there and I cut it out and put science on it and put it on the table.
Okay.
Just a cross on that history. एक पेपर में history and science लिखा है, history के ऊपर एक cross कर दिए और science है नीचे. And that it's there on the table and the child will do it.
Okay.
It can be as simple as that.
Okay.
Visual, they are hugely visual learners. And if I can make things visual, then they will learn that much better. The more visual cues there are, the better it works for them. It's like I was talking about a timetable. If they can have this on the day's timetable on the table, in whichever format, whichever one of the three formats that I was talking about, it makes it very clear for them. It helps them to regulate themselves. They need this kind of structure. It's a bit like, हम में कोई है जो डायरी को बहुत स्ट्रांगली यूज करते हैं. आज हमारा ये है ये है ये है, वो डायरी नहीं देखेंगे तो वी फाइंड इट हार्ड टू फंक्शन. हम में कोई है जो डायरी कभी यूज भी नहीं करते हैं, बट मेनी ऑफ अस नीड टू हैव द डायरी टू नो कि आज क्या क्या होने वाला है. वो हमको RCI जाना है, परसों हमको जाना है. So it's like their diary. That is a structure for me. This is a structure for them.
तो घर पे भी लगता होगा?
हाँ, yeah, बहुत यूज होते हैं. And we use this kind of a structure, a visual. For instance, I'll just jump to something else and give you another example. Sometimes, see, people with autism, because उनके जो ये social differences है और communication understanding का differences है, oftentimes this can lead to a lot of anxiety, right? They can sometimes have a lot of anxiety building up. And when there is anxiety, they can find it very hard to control because they are not able to, even though they might be wonderful in communicating otherwise, and it is a communication impairment. So बहुत अच्छा communicate करता है, मगर जो anxiety build up कर रहा है, क्यों build up कर रहा है, they can't talk about it. That can often happen. So it is a good idea to sometimes give them a little visual like this to keep on their table. This is just on the child's table. And it has things like if the child tends to talk a lot, or if his hands are going all over the place, or he's getting up and moving around, I just keep them on the table. Initially, the teacher might have to periodically just point at it and do this, you know. If the child is getting up, just say, Rahul, okay. And, or, you know, his hands are going all over and the teacher said, you got to sit quietly, fold hands. So he just does this. After a period, all the child needs is to have this on the table. And it's a visual cue for him and he'll sit there, he will not get up. So simple visual instructions like this, जो वो देख रहा है, हम बोलने से हर बार काम कभी कभी नहीं होता है. और टीचर्स कभी कभी बोलते रहते, राहुल कीप सिटिंग, राहुल डोंट गेट अप, राहुल सिट. इट मे नॉट वर्क एज वेल एज उसके साथ हमें एक ये दे दे. सो ही विल सी दैट एंड द चाइल्ड विल कीप सिटिंग. राइट.
तो ये जो विजुअल क्यूज के बारे में आप कह रहे हैं, ये अगर टीचर ऑडिटरी मेथड ऑफ टीचिंग लेक्चर वगैरह देता है और दूसरा कोई टीचर है जो बोर्ड में सब कुछ लिख के देता या चार्ट दिखाता, तो आप ये कह रहे हो कि जो ऑटिस्टिक बच्चा है वो विजुअल से ज्यादा सीखेगा यानी ऑडिटरी से? सो लेक्चर से ज्यादा बोर्ड संभाल करे.
या सी एक्चुअली हम सब कोई बहुत ज्यादा विजुअल लर्नर्स है. लाइक हमारे स्कूल में जब हम ज्योग्राफी के बारे फॉर इंस्टेंस कर रहे थे, जो टीचर्स हमको स्टोन्स लाकर दिखाया है, मैप बनाकर दिखाया है विथ यू नो रेज दिस थिंग फॉर माउंटेन्स एंड इंडेंटेशंस फॉर रिवर्स, वो कभी हम भूलते नहीं हैं बिकॉज वी यूज डिफरेंट मोडालिटीज और हम विजुअल्स बहुत यूज किए हैं. राइट. जो टीचर्स खाली किताब से पढ़कर सिखाए हैं हम भूल गए हैं. Because we all learn through a range of modalities versus just one. As we become advanced learners, then we can learn only through auditory. Then it becomes easier. But in the early years, we learn very well through visual. And people with autism are very strong, most of them. I would say maybe 99% or 95% are stronger visual learners. So if I make things more visual, they learn much better. And using these is just using the visual strength. Like memory, I was talking about memory earlier. Memory is a strength. The visual aspect is also a huge strength for people with autism. And therefore we use that to help them be in an inclusive setup. Okay. All right. So with an early learner, some of the things that I had said earlier, a speech has to be very clear. We have to use brief, concrete sentences. We have to address the student individually. सब जो हम इसके पहले बोले थे, लैंग्वेज को क्लियर रखना है, sarcasm नहीं यूज करेंगे, metaphors नहीं यूज करेंगे. These are all with early learners.
What about jokes?
Jokes, they don't get it.
They don't get.
They don't get jokes.
Yeah.
They begin to get simple jokes later on, and with some of the ones who have more more autistic, let's say, hum uske saath we have done jokes, teaching them the concept of jokes, and they've begun to get it. But they don't get jokes quite the way we do, particularly complex jokes. No, they don't. All right. Then we have to use concrete methods. It's something, again, you ask the questions in perfect timing, because this is exactly it. We have to teach through different modalities. For instance, I was talking about the strength that they have with their memory, very very strong memory. Now, जब हम स्कूल में मैथ सिखाते हैं, हमारे इंडिया में we tend to get very bookish, very very bookish. तो हम मैथ यूजुअली सिखाते हैं ऐसा करके. We might have something like this in the blackboard of the book. And how do we teach them counting? We tell them to start, say, okay, 1, 2, 3, and they say 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, and here 4. The thing is that because their because their memory is so good, they learn their numbers. Okay?
Quickly.
Yeah. Many kids with autism, वो communicate नहीं करता है, मगर they will know from 1 to 2000. All right? They will know it by rote. They will be able to, but they may not know counting. Now, when you teach them counting, they will do something like, they will look at this and they go 1, 2, okay. They will learn the numbers by rote. They will also learn the shape names. So they will know this shape is called 3, this shape is called 4, this shape is called 7. They will learn the shape, right? Now, with non-autistic people, if you're counting, you have got the concept. You may not know the shape, but you've got the concept. The people with autism, they might know it by rote. They might even learn the shape. They'll even do things like 1, 2, 3 and write 3, but they haven't got the concept.
Okay.
Why? What they are doing now is they are going 1, 2, 3. They know that 3 means this shape, so they put it down. But they don't know that that means 3. They don't know that there are 3 books and that is also 3. They don't get that. Okay? And I will talk a little bit more about the math thing in a bit.
Okay.
Break.